Hello, welcome to the second session of Painting for Beginners. Today we'll be looking at combining watercolour with other materials such as pens, pencils and pastels. I'm going to demonstrate two different things today. The first is doing a cityscape with pen and wash. This one is the wash is actually coffee. You get some lovely different brown tones, really quite rich, and the biro pen. Although you could go more multicoloured, I find this a particularly useful technique for going out and sketching. And what I would encourage you to do is try what I demonstrate, which is the continuous line technique, where you try not to take your pen off the paper and you focus very much on detail, rather than getting too bogged down in getting things exact. And you'd be surprised if you focus enough on the detail, all the wonky bits sort of straighten themselves out. The eye sort of is tricked into not seeing how offset or wonky or out of proportion different parts are. So it's a nice technique for just relaxing and sketching outdoors in particular, where it's much more about capturing the mood of what you're looking at rather than capturing the exact proportions. If you wanted to get the exact proportions, you could take a photograph. This is much more about mood and feeling and getting into looking at things. So I'm going to demonstrate that in a quick fast forward demonstration. So I've been working on this for about 15 minutes. You could carry on for longer. You might spend a whole hour just drawing all those details. I got the picture from a magazine, and as I was drawing it, I started to realise, hang on a minute, is this Venice? And I think it is. It looks like it might be. But what was very interesting about the drawing was all the things I started to notice, like just here, this spiral shape on the side of the building, the clock on that building there, the little figures on top of the buildings, which I hadn't really noticed before. So it really is a good way to get your eye really looking. Now you can leave a drawing just like that, or you can add colour into it. Here's one that I've done previously. Similar technique, a little bit of extra detail has been put in without using continuous line, but I've used watercolour quite strongly to colour the image. If you haven't got paint at home but you've got a brush, then you could make your own paint. Today I'm going to use coffee. So I've mixed some coffee up quite strong with water, and I'm going to use this to start to add some colour in there. And here are some simple pen and wash examples from students. Next thing we're going to look at is creating a landscape picture which combines watercolours with, in this case, coloured pencils, oil pastels, and so on. It can be something which is quite naturalistic if you want to, or it could be really quite patterned and playful, like this one here. But it's about marks and textures and so on. So in order to prepare for that, we're going to do a couple of exercises. Our picture is going to start out as a line drawing. And what I'm going to encourage you to do is, rather than look at a big broad landscape, try to look at a slice through it. So in this case you can see all these different layers, one in front of the other, each of which I can play around and practice and do different things in. So it gives me an interesting picture space to play around in. It can allow you to become much more abstract if you want to, rather than worrying too much about the about being naturalistic. However, what we do need to think about if we're going to be drawing this is trying to make the line we use interesting. So try not to repeat the same sort of line all the time, but use different types of marks in different places, like we've got here. In order to do that, what we're going to do is an exercise in building up a vocabulary of marks. This handout from our classes shows a range of different marks, your vocabulary. Of course there are many more, but they're useful ones to just get you started. And you could decide that you're going to be drawing the initial outline in pencil. It could be in coloured pencil, it could be in pen, that's up to you. But trying to have a variety of marks so that you make it interesting. So I know you can see all those, but I'm still going to go through them, drawing them. So the first is flowing lines, which can be long or short, can flow and overlap in different sorts of ways. The second is spiky lines, long and short again. Opposed by spike, I kind of mean upright spikes like grasses. Dashed lines, they could be sideways or they can be in this direction. They could suggest paths or all kinds of different things. Zigzags. Zigzags can lean over, be really quite tight. They can be looser. Crosshatch is a useful tool. Dots, little circles, different sizes. Scribble. Now scribble is quite a lovely sort of thing. There's all kinds of scribble. So sort of this scribble which is quite angular, like this one. And scribble is much more sort of swirling. And scribble is almost kind of big and angry. Kinds. Cracks, so lines which break and then break again and break again. Quite nice, obviously, for trees, rivers, streams, that sort of thing. It all lends itself to those sorts of things. And finally, one of my favourite ones, which is a wall, which involves going to the right, down, to the left, back up. And working that over and over again, allow it to overlap. So keep turning at 90 degrees. Doesn't matter which way around you go, you can go the other way around if you prefer. It builds up a much more sort of regular sort of pattern, a little bit like a dry stone wall. So those are all quite useful marks to make, and you may well be able to make up many more of your own. Try combining some of those marks in quick experimental sketches using the glazing and wetting wet techniques that we explored in the last session. So here we see sort of pen marks with glazing. You can see the layers of different colours as they've built up over the top of each other. On the other hand, here we have the looseness of wet in wet combined with really quite a range of different types of marks. But now we're going to move on to a couple of more exercises where we use other things with your watercolours. So I have a few materials to show you now, and you don't need to get all of them. Get whatever you fancy or use what you've got. The First is coloured pencils. Now, I always favour watercolour pencil because they're softer and the colours tend to be richer. The thing about pencils is the cheaper they are, the worse quality they are, and that might seem obvious, but something like Faber-Castell produce a lot of different levels of equipment. So these, although they say aquarelle, they're not as good as these ones here, which cost quite a bit more, but it's worth the investment because, you know, watercolour pencils are lovely things. They're really worth having to play with. But I will be sticking with these ones, which are pretty good value. On the other hand, when it comes to pens, I favour cheap ones like these from Lidl's because they're water soluble, they're not permanent. So when you add water to them, they run, and it's just fantastic. You can get quite a wide range of colours, and you can buy a pack for, I think it's about £1. Finally, the other thing we'll look at today is oil pastels. You may not have any. You can always use, for the exercise I demonstrate, a bit of candle if you haven't got any woodwork. But for these, W.H. Smith's is a very good place to get a basic one, because this is really about watercolours. You don't need to have a really high quality oil pastel. So I've got a black pen, I've got some coloured pens, coloured pencils and oil pastels. The first thing I'm going to do is just sketch out some sort of idea of a sort of rough made up landscape. Just making this up, and this is just a sort of practice piece just to try out a few different things on it. So just sort of roughing it out, yeah, something like that. Maybe give it a bit more interesting texture in a few places, so more spiky here. Let's get some scribble coming down here, sort of rocky scribble. Not too much, particularly because I'm using black. Just enough to give it a bit more interest, so maybe some flowing lines through here. Breaking it up into some interesting looking areas. And today I'm going to be working with the Analinkis. Again, you could be working with watercolour, absolutely fine. You get some really nice results with watercolour. In fact, I was going to just show these. These are with watercolour and a little bit of coffee and a little bit of something called copper water, which is basically copper pipe in vinegar. It's just the blue from that. You know, you can get some lovely effects alongside pens. But today I thought I would use the Analinki just to show what they can do. So, remembering the different techniques, wetting that sky. I'm going to put a bit of colour in there, into that sky, just there, nice bright colour there. And let's just let that tip and run a little bit, just playing around. Remember, this is just a practice one, but it's just sort of a reminder of some of the techniques. And in this area here, I'm going to put a little bit of oil pastel. Now, I can use the oil pastel in two different ways. I can use it on its side to just create a little bit of texture, using it really quite lightly, or I can use it on its tip to create some very definite sort of bits. Yeah, and let me show you the effect of that. So I want to have a contrasting colour, so this will turn up. You might think this is a little bit gaudy, but I'm going to go for some purple over the top of that. can you see the oil pastel showing through? All of it shows through. You know, even the very gentle shows through really quite nicely. Let's not leave that like that. Let's have some more colour in there. So a little bit of wet on this. What sort of colour should I go for? A bit of red in there. Are these natural colours? Maybe not. I don't mind. Just playing around. You can see oil pastels create that little bit of extra texture and marks in there if you want them. Dab of, I'm putting colours which are close to the purple just to sort of enhance it, and I'm going to let that run wet in wet. Down the bottom, build up some colour. Look at how those cheap pens run. It's quite nice how they blend and run. Just putting a bit of colour in there. Again, just all wet at the moment. And whilst it's still wet, I'm going to take my coloured pencils and I'm just going to start to drag through it, making marks. The fact that the watercolour pencil means that they will blend in quite nicely, just sort of building back in. You can leave it till it's dry, it doesn't matter. With pens, only do this when it's dry. If you do it when it's wet, you will block up the pen. It will stop working. A bit more contrast in there, I think. Some of the colours out. Let's see. Oops, sorry, getting my arm in the way. Bit of blue in there. And what shall I do in some of the other areas? Don't forget about glazing. So I'm going to put some colours in these areas, which I'm going to leave to dry, and then glaze back over them. I like using the Analinkies because they're so bright. Try not to be afraid of using strong colour. Okay, so I've dried that off, and now let me just show you a few things that I can begin to do. Let's see, I've got this bit of candle, and I'll make this very clear, so I'm just going to kind of drag this across here. You can't see it. I can't see it either, actually. I just have to remember where I just put those lines. Now I'm going to go back over that with a bit of blue. Hopefully what you'll find, a little bit of blue, is candle wax resisting where I've put it. So you're getting these sort of lines forming as I build that over the top. So these sort of lines here where the candle has gone. Perhaps I need to use a darker colour to make it really show up. Let's try something really dark, and then they'll, there, now the lines really start to show up. I'm going to glaze a bit more up here, just a quick reminder about glazing. So let's see, I want to keep it quite sort of light colours, so I think I'll go with some sort of browns. Just putting that in. Oh, I didn't mean to pick up that purple, that was all by accident. I shall make the most of that. Just move that in a little bit. And I think what I'm going to do is just drag that out a little bit as well. Just pick it up with this purple pencil and pull it around and blend it around a bit. Start to add more sort of texture and scribble and marks into this. The colour on this section is definitely a bit too bold though, so let's actually take some of it down with a bit of white oil pastel worked over the top. And again, I might put a bit more pencil back in there too. So work some pencil in, enhancing those little textures. I think we could do some more darker green in this area here. So let's start to put some in. Building, glazing it over the top, building it up. And this section in the middle, I'll just mention it's still dry, which means that I could do some work with a pen on it, but it must be dry if you're going to work with a pen, otherwise you'll ruin it. So I'm going to take a couple of pens. So I'm going to just sort of begin to work some rocky marks. My brown seems to run out, so I will just concentrate on using the orange. Being careful not to go onto any of the wet areas. And I'm going to come back in with my fine brush. A bit more water to it. If I wet it a lot, the pen will dissolve, which is quite nice. Wet it a little, it will keep the mark. And just fiddling around a little bit more. And hopefully you can see all those different types of textural marks that you can play with. Again, the sky is just a little bit strong in places, so I can go back over with a bit more pastel. Turn that down a bit. And what I can do is keep working on top of that, building and playing around with the colours, tone them down with oil pastels if I want to, build up textures with the pencils, with pens, as long as the paper is dry. So I suggest that you do one or two practices working with the techniques that you already know, the glazing and the wetting wet. There's things I didn't do here yet, for example, like splattering, which would be quite nice in the foreground and which was done on this one here. But also things like blowing with a straw, dragging, and all those sorts of techniques. Have a little practice and a play for a made-up landscape, and then when you're ready, move on to perhaps a larger, more developed landscape piece. So when you're ready, your first step is to work on the basic outline of the background. Here I've used a pen that's water soluble, so a cheap pen, and you can see a sort of swirling sort of mark, flow mark here, much more scribbly, twirly, spiky marks here, zigzags, spikes, dots, and so on. And this is a foundation Don't go overboard filling all the areas though with pen, because the main thing is working with the watercolour. So you've got this base. It could be that you do this in coloured pencil. It could be that you do it in coloured pens or even a biro. But this is your basic sort of layout. And I'd encourage this sort of format because it's really nice to think about all of these different layers through the landscape. Once you've done that, it's a matter of working on it section by section, trying to make this as inventive as possible. So trying out different techniques. So here we've got a little bit of glazing in the sky with white over the top of a wash. We've got wet in wet here. We've got a little bit of oil pastel used here to create texture. We've got oil pastel again down here. This one much more based around sort of patterns, so really kind of playing around a lot more with pattern in those different areas. And this one very scribbly, scribbling around a lot with watercolour pencils and with oil pastels. These three, on the other hand, work with a much more subdued colour palette. But again, you can see the use of the lines to the sky, creating this quite stormy effect with a lot of glazing of one colour over the top another to build it up. You can see patches of glazing and wet in wet through here. You can see reworking with pen over the top to create detail on the top of these sort of spiky fences. And again, wet in wet techniques. And quite an interesting sort of banding of colour through here, from the blues and purples in the background, little hint of orange and brown, back to the purples, and then through these sort of range of greens, and that sort of layering one section on top of another, so you get this wonderful slice through the landscape. That's all for today. In a moment there's going to be a slideshow of work from some past students exploring this sort of landscape mixed media, and the next session, we will be looking at the basics of using acrylic paints. Remember, I hope you enjoy this session, and remember, if you do Facebook, please do post examples of what you achieve on the Artful Facebook page. Details coming up later. Thanks then, bye bye.